Well, hey, everybody. Welcome back to season 1 of Public Voices. I'm Doug.
And I'm Nicole.
And this is so exciting because before we kind of dive into anything at all about it, we are literally starting off our new season. We've finished the pilot season and we are in season 1. How does that make you feel, Nicole?
Excited, but a little
Yeah.
bit nervous for what's coming in season 1 officially.
You don't even know what's coming in season 2. I've already heard bits of it and just
It's
wait to
too
see what
far out.
happens. It's a little ways out, but we are excited. We are officially in season 1 of Public Voices and we are thrilled to be with you. So today we are talking about something that we all know a little bit about, whether we've experienced it, and that's cross-functional communication. So Nicole, what do you think of when you hear the term cross-functional communication?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think about making sure that there's inclusivity and that we have the right people on the emails or the right people in the meetings. But before we jump in even further, let's take a quick minute to thank our sponsor, NEOGOV, who makes this podcast possible. Are you ready to get started about
Uh,
cross communication,
I am so ready to
cross-functional?
cross communicate functionally throughout the entire length of this podcast, right? So, when we talk about this whole thing, and obviously you spend a lot of time in human resources. So when we talk about cross-functional communication, what it actually looks like. Now we can talk high level theory. We can talk about the things that people discuss about it and so on and so forth. But what we want to dive into today is kind of some of the actual sticking points, that those moments of friction that affect our organizations and how we all work together specifically. And that's some of the challenge that we really do have. And I think about it from a public safety perspective specifically. And, the one thing I guess I always went into when I was a chief, I realized something. I think it's realizing really that, you know, we're kind of all on the same team, but sometimes it feels like we're working against one another for some reason that is really
Mhm.
unknown. Nobody really knows why, right?
Yeah,
And that
absolutely.
could be a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. That was actually one of the things I thought about when we were talking about this or, considering what to talk about for this episode was we all really are working together, but for some reason, depending on our communication style, it can seem like we're working against each other. And so we don't necessarily articulate the why to the group, and then we all get off track and start going down our own paths versus truly working together to solve an issue.
Yeah, and it's funny because and you and I've had decades of service within our organizations. Um, every group though always feels like they're carrying like the heaviest load. It happens
Mhm.
all the time, and it's not because people are selfish. It's because people feel their own stress. Like when you're at
Mhm.
work and you're dealing with the day to day and what's to come next week, or in our case, next podcast season. You
Yep.
have all these things lined up, and this weighs on us because it can be a little heavy, but it's the work that we do. So it's not because we're selfish. It's because we're seeing our stress. Like patrol officers, they see calls stacking up, which is stressful. They can't get to those calls in the amount of time that they want to get them into them to. Dispatch sees calls pending that patrol doesn't even know about from their perspective. You saw vacancies, you probably saw burnout, you saw issues of recruitment and retention and those types of things. And when you're in command, you see budget numbers and you see meetings. So we all have
Mhm.
different perspectives, but it's still all very real to us in terms of what that beginning of that cross functional communication starts to look like and how it starts to play out.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a concept called the curse of knowledge, and it talks about how, when you know too much about your own work group or your own organization, you kind of miss what's happening around you. And it's hard for you to have perspective because you're so hyper focused on what's happening in your group. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about, that employees are very focused on their group, their tasks, their goals, and don't necessarily realize that everyone around them is just as busy, right? And so giving a little grace and saying, I understand everyone is busy, but how can we, work towards solving this bigger picture, bigger goal together, would be very helpful.
Yeah, and as a public safety leader, one of the things I realized before too long was that I wasn't leading one department. I was leading a number of smaller departments within that larger department, and they just happened to wear the same patch most of the time. all contributing to the same job. But once you realize that you're leading all these different groups, these smaller departments with their own needs, with their own challenges, it kind of changes your perspective a little bit. And I think about like dispatch versus patrol. Like this is a thing, right? So dispatch, they're busy, they're taking 911 calls, other calls for service. They don't feel like, can you guys clear these calls quicker? Because I've got more calls holding. And there's some frustration that builds from that. Likewise, patrol thinks dispatch doesn't. You don't know what it's like out here in the field. You don't know what it takes to deal with somebody that's going through some challenges and how long that takes. It's not an easy, quick fix. You can't just snap your fingers. So that's one of the examples I think of when I think of you know cross-functional friction, so to
Mhm.
speak, in particular. And maybe you saw some of that in human resources too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think you see it, across the board. There's friction between HR and payroll. There's friction between HR and every department, right? Because sometimes, depending on your culture, HR is seen as the principal's office versus someone that can help you elevate your work group and, learn and develop. And so it is fascinating to see those like subgroups kind of have tension, but then on the bigger picture too, it does exist. And as director, like as a chief, how did you address that? Like where did you um try to solve that problem, or how did you try to, slowly chip away at it?
Well, I think it first starts with everybody's understanding that it is a problem and it is an issue, and not just, like I said before, a personality thing. It's not just, well, they don't like us or they don't want to work with us or whatever it looks like. So, and I'll take like an HR versus an operational or a department leader situation to the same example. So, like HR announces this new hiring process, so this is how we're going to go through the process to hire people. These are the steps, these are the requirements, so on and so forth. Um, but operationally, I would look at it and I'm like, all right, this is going to make things harder on me because X, Y, Z. Now, whether that's real or not, I don't. Who knows? But
Mhm,
that's how I feel because I already have a system. But because we want to, have a unified system of doing things, that's what HR does. And then HR comes back and kind of wonders why nobody's following the process that they spent a long time creating because there's no communication between the two
mhm,
sometimes. And it's not
mhm.
because the system's bad, it's just because we're not communicating about the requirements and the needs from the HR perspective necessarily versus the requirements needs from the policing, in my case, perspective. So I think that's part of the battle is just sitting down and just having a
Mhm,
conversation of like, look, these are our objectives. This is what we're here to do. My goal is to facilitate making sure that we do everything we possibly can to reach those objectives in the way that goes with our policies, procedures, and the city charter, and so on and so forth, if you're working in a
mhm,
city. So I think just kind of laying those things out, and likewise, HR or legal or streets or fire, whomever else would say, well, these are our responsibilities. This is what
mhm.
we're tasked to do. So I think it all starts with a conversation, an actual in person, not email, not email
Yeah.
conversation.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think one of my biggest pet peeves when anyone was trying to roll out change was not explaining the why, right? It would just be HR said, which drove me crazy, or the city manager said. And those are not helpful. And that employees resist that almost, right? Like you're off to a terrible start if you're just like, well, HR said you have to do the hiring process like this, versus, like you said, having a conversation to say, here's why we changed the tools, here's why we are changing that process. And then, yes, how does it impact your operations? And does this jibe with that? Are there little tweaks we could make so we're compromising and coming to the same outcome, but not making it not making more work for each department in the long run, right?
Yeah.
Because that's really ultimately what the fear is you're just adding one more thing to my plate and I don't have time for this. And so how can we make it where we're both compromising but getting to the outcome that we need to?
Do you feel like a lot of those assumptions that we make on either side of the table are really kind of based on things that we've, when you think about it, never truly verified in the first place? Those are just assumptions. They're things that we'll call them, urban legends almost about,
Hmm.
well, this is why they did this way and they've always done it this way, or this is why they're this way. But we've never sat
Hmm.
down and just actually asked the question, much like what you just said
Yeah.
about adding more things to the table.
Yeah, it's so true. That actually makes me think of a story. We had a new fire chief, and on his very first day, he came in and we hit him with some pretty severe investigation issues that were going on. And so he looked at us as HR and said, okay, what do I do? And we said, "Well, here's your options." And he's like, "Well, you're not gonna tell me what to do?" And he was a long-term employee that had worked his way up the ranks. And we said, "No, you're the chief. You get to make the decision here. This is your department, your employees. Here's your options." And he kind of had this aha moment and he said, "Every chief I've ever worked with, anytime something like this has happened, they've said, 'HR made me do this.'" And so he always thought that HR was directing the department. And so it's fascinating that when you do just have those conversations, those things come to light and people realize kind of how they've been led down the wrong path or been misinformed for years and years. And when you have all the information or you have more information, it changes everything and completely shifts your perspective.
Yeah. Assumptions, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And I don't,
Yeah.
I would say even further, I think why it actually happens is I don't think organizational conflict starts with people that have ill will or want to cause problems. I don't think that's where it starts. I think it
Mhm,
starts with bad systems in place. And
mhm,
I think there's a big distinction between the two. You've got systems that aren't working the way they're supposed to work versus people that just at the end of the day just want to do their jobs and want to do it right. And
mhm,
you and I both seen that across the board in the agencies in which we've worked. So I think systems, making sure that we differentiate and we kind of drill down to the fact that this is a systems problem and
mhm.
not necessarily just always a person problem.
Yeah, no, exactly. I actually taught that to my team all the time, like focus on the problem, not the person. Because then people are less likely to get defensive, less likely to, resist that conversation or resist that change when exactly what you said. What is the problem or what is the process that we need to improve? Not you need to change everything you're doing and be a completely different employee. Those are very different tactics or approaches to take when having that conversation.
And I think when we talk about like the structural issues of organizations and how we disseminate information with throughout the organization, and again, from my perspective, a police department. So
Mhm,
and we're competing. It's budget season, which is everybody's favorite time of year.
mhm.
I don't think anybody says that. I don't.
Yeah.
Maybe some of the
You're saying
viewers.
that facetiously, yeah.
Right, right. This is my sarcasm meter is kicking up
Yeah.
here, so you're probably reading that. But it's budget season. We all know what budget season means. That we're all going to come in a room. There's going to be a cage. We're going to fight it out. A
Mhm,
little less dramatic than that, but we are going to
mhm,
fight or compete for the same pool of dollars that we all know is there, and everybody's going to come together and try and figure that out. So that's already setting up some of the challenges ahead of time to sort of pit people against one another, not personally, but just to figure
mhm,
out how they're going to move forward. And when resources become more scarce, people are going to protect their mission, and
mhm,
that's just part of it. And the problem is when we look at like a public safety agency, you've got like dispatch that reports somewhere, HR reports somewhere else, the training department and the police department reports to somewhere, records to somewhere else. And so there's no connection between all these different systems necessarily to make sure that we're aligned still towards that singular goal.
No, that's very, very true. I've experienced the close to cage fighting in budget meetings, especially with, like, capital dollars, right? Everyone is, um, like you said, fighting for those resources, and it's just limited amounts and kind of guesstimates, right? We're assuming we're going to get this much tax revenue, and if that doesn't happen, which project will be on the chopping block? So people do get, um a little anxious and a little defensive and maybe a little aggressive because they know their operations best, back to that curse of knowledge, and they know the ripple and the implications if they don't get those dollars, right? And so back to kind of understanding that we're all there to do the same job, which is to make the community better, but we do get stuck in our own heads of, oh, they're being selfish or they're being greedy, but we don't understand their operations or that their plant, the water treatment plant is falling apart and they rely on those dollars to make sure the community has safe water. And so I think it's really important in an organization, especially for like a support function like HR or finance, to really understand the operations so you can be supportive to them. I wouldn't expect, police and fire to understand public services like engineering and streets, but for the support functions to really understand that so they can truly support and maybe kind of help translate some of that because sometimes we speak in this language that's acronyms or very technical heavy, and the group around us doesn't understand and might not feel safe enough to raise their hand and ask a question. So I think it's super important that when we are communicating across departments, that we're using language that everyone can understand, because that can create even more problems.
Yep. Yep. I think, look, we all have org charts, and org charts are absolutely necessary. But I would suggest that maybe the relational chart is what determines whether or not we're going to be successful within an organization. It's people don't work across, those different silos. They work across and through trust. And when we start building that trust amongst different groups and organizations, I think that's where we win. But yeah, this is fascinating stuff. I think we would be missing something though if we didn't talk a little bit about some of what I would call the joking and how we deal with things in public safety in particular. We're guilty as charged, right? Versus how it really feels, like how it really impacts us. And yes, having worked as a chief and in policing agency for 30 plus years, we made a lot of jokes about the fire department, a lot of jokes. And likewise, they would do the same with us. They'd come up to you and say, "Is that powdered sugar on your uniform?" With the donut joke. Or we would say,
Uh-huh.
which cat did you save today out of a tree? All those types of things. What did he look like? Did you take him home? All those.
Mhm.
So we would go back and forth, and it was banter and it was fun and those kinds of things. But we also understood, because it was part of the culture, that um, that can cover sometimes deeper feelings that we kind of we take it through those sarcastic sort of moments, but there can be some deeper feelings of mistrust or just or having some challenges on working with other people too. I mean, wouldn't you agree with that? I mean, from your perspective globally as HR, certainly you've seen that.
Oh, yeah, I've definitely experienced the police versus fire, and it is entertaining to watch you guys kinda riff and joke with each other. But I think, one kind of legacy issue or historical issue in my agency was police and fire got all the money, right? That was the
Mhm.
story that, employees had created, that anytime police and fire want something, there's unlimited money for them. And that really made those non-police and fire groups feel left out, or kind of feel dismissed, or feel that their operations weren't as important. And what's ironic is when you talk to police and fire, they believe everyone else is getting the money, right? And so again, it goes back to that communication of when a budget comes out and when a budget is approved. Our city manager would put out a budget message that was like 30 pages, but we would articulate, here's where the money went, here's the projects that are getting dollars and why. Because that back and forth joking, or that like constant like, "Oh, police and fire, they get everything." That really does impact people, where they do feel, less than or left out, and that's not a good culture to create across the board.
Yeah, and even within departments, the joking about police and fire getting a lot of money, and public safety typically does take up a lot of the budget. I
Mhm,
mean, more than 50% of any municipal, for example, organization across the board.
mhm,
But those services, because they're so people oriented, they require people to go out and actually interact with the public and all the things. And fire trucks are so expensive. I mean, they last a long
mhm,
time, but they're really expensive. And
mhm,
there's all the other things to keep the lights on and so on and so forth. But even within a police department, it's funny you'd mention the budget piece and we go back to it but I think it's important because even within a police department, there are still silos. So you've
mhm,
got, everybody else versus police and fire with the budget money. But even
mhm.
within the police department, you've got
Yes.
records or dispatch versus patrol or investigations. So you've got this
Mhm,
like back and forth of, well, really the only time a records, somebody that's managing records might say, well, the only time you need us is when you really need something from us, like a report, or you
mhm,
need us to manage something, or dispatch. It feels like we're sort of the hidden away thing that nobody sees, but we're
mhm,
actually the what I would call the first responders. We've talked about that before. So even within those departments, people don't come to the table or don't feel like they're coming to the table sometime. And I think that goes back to your communications piece
mhm,
of bringing people together to talk about. You mentioned that lengthy budget memo, the why of things. Why do we
mhm.
do it this way? What's this look like, and what's our reality, and how are we going to live through that together as a team cohesively?
Yeah. Well, and I think to those examples, perception is reality, right? If the record supervisor is feeling like she isn't getting enough to support her team and for her team to support patrol, someone needs to listen to that. And maybe she's misinformed, or maybe there is validity to those concerns. If patrol is constantly getting new employees and we're growing that patrol staff, but we're not increasing our record staff to support them, that team's going to feel it in volume, right? And so again, we need to be active listeners when our leaders are saying things like that, and they might not have the ability to articulate the exact problem, but let's hear them say, "Oh, patrol gets everything. Like, okay, tell me more about that. What does that mean? What does that look like to you? And you can help them fill in the blanks, or you can say, oh, that does make sense. Maybe you do need more staff to support that bigger patrol group. Now let's talk about that. But I think just letting those jokes continue without digging a little deeper is not necessarily a good thing.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that people rarely leave an organization because of a joke, right?
Hmm.
But they
Right.
do leave organizations the moment they feel like that the mission that they're trying to work towards doesn't matter anymore, or that
Hmm.
their work doesn't matter in that mission. And I think that's the differentiating point when we don't go deeper and ask questions like you did. Well, let's unwind this a little bit. Let's talk a little bit
Hmm.
more about why you feel this way, what it actually looks like. And then many times when there's an understanding of, oh, I didn't know that's how that operates, or I didn't know we were within those guidelines, or we can't spend this money on this. Why can't we spend extra personnel money on the new equipment we need for the department, or whatever it happens to
Hmm.
be? Without explaining that why, it leaves space for question marks. And that can be really tricky. And we all know we're going to fill in the blank with the worst possible scenario.
Yeah, and even I think it's good to tell employees like, "Hey, that's a valid concern. Let's have a plan for next budget year. This budget year
Mhm.
just went through, but let's get a plan in place to ask for additional personnel or ask for additional resources for next budget year." So those leaders know you're working towards something together versus just kind of leaving them in the dark.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with you. So there's so much to delve into here when we talk about communication because
I
I
know.
think I think we fail so much because we don't communicate properly, or we rely
Mhm.
on an email or a text, which we all know that sometimes an email and a text, there's so many parody videos out there of people texting one another and sort of making fun of, of what that looks like, about how it's sent and the intent with which it's sent versus what's read on the other side based on
Yes.
their experiences or how they're feeling in that moment or whatever else. So I think, when we get past the texts and the emails, we actually have that in-person conversation. And I love what you just said about, this budget year's done, but let's have a plan next year and start lining
Mhm.
out specifically what you need, why we need it, and let's have a discussion about it as a group. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Well, I'm very curious as to your takeaways. Yeah, let's
Okay.
talk a little bit about some. We always need to have takeaways from every episode. We could talk for
Yes,
another
of
hour
course.
on this, but we probably
I
should
know.
should cut it off and let's take some takeaways. Then we'll build on it another time. Sound good?
Perfect.
Love it.
So I would say just kind of, going back and forth, I think a lot of what we talked about was kind of the miscommunication, whether it was not sharing all the information or misunderstanding. And so I guess my takeaway would be for anyone, regardless if they're in a leadership role or not, to always ask questions and try to get the correct information or fill in the missing information that you don't have, or even just tell your leader like, hey, you sent me that text and what I took it to mean was X. Is that how you meant it? And so just again for employees to use their voice and say, "Hey, are we on the same page? Are we going in the same direction? Let's make sure we are," because that miscommunication can get so out of hand so quickly that it's just easier to ask that question and clarify up front.
Yeah, agreed. Well spoken. And I think that takes me to sort of my, I think, takeaway for this in particular. So I'm going to operationalize, I think, I want to try to operationalize what you just said and give our listeners and our viewers some homework this time.
Oh, I like it.
So
I like
I know
it.
homework, who doesn't love homework aside from
Everyone.
everyone, right? Everyone, right? So here's the homework to all of you out there, and then we can kind of maybe hear something from our listeners and our viewers as to how these things went. So it'd be great if you could take a week or take this week, sometime this week during your week or next week, whenever it happens to be, but not too far away, and take 20 minutes out of your time and find somebody in your organization who you don't routinely talk to, maybe don't know that well, in a different part of the department or wherever you happen to work, and then sit down with them and say, hey, I just want 20 minutes of your time. And you ask them the question of, what's one thing that you wish everybody else in the agency knew about your job? And I think that's profound a little bit because it's going to make people think, oh, well, I don't think my job is understood, or I don't think people know exactly what I do. Well, let's dive into that and
Mhm.
let's talk about what your job is and what you do and how you do it and why you take the pride in your job and those types of things. And I think that we're really going to hear some great responses from people if you just take the time, back to everything we've talked about this whole episode about
Mhm.
communication and your suggestion of going out and just having the conversation. Don't send an emoji or a funny meme or anything. Go and sit down and talk with them for 20 minutes. Ask them the question and then listen, and then start to break down that silo and start to open up lines of communication. I think that's my homework. So I want to see if you do it. You might, if especially if you come to Ignite, you might get a special prize from us if you report on your homework.
I love it.
And yeah, we want to hear what you have to say about it. So that's my
I love
takeaway.
it. I think
Yeah.
that's great homework because one, the person asking the questions gets to learn about their peer, and the person answering the questions will likely feel valued because someone is curious about their role. So there's two things culturally that are happening with that. That if even if someone makes that a habit and does that once a month, that will go really,
Mm.
really long way.
Yeah.
Great suggestion. So we want to thank the listeners for joining Public Voices, and thanks again to our sponsor NeoGov, the leading HR software provider for public sector, and for supporting these conversations. Be sure to follow along with Doug and I on YouTube or Spotify or wherever you're listening to podcasts, and don't forget to rate us.
5 stars. Anyway, so
Just a
I,
suggestion, five
right.
stars.
Did I say that out loud? Sometimes my inside voice doesn't stay inside. So there we go. Well, in all seriousness, though, we do hope today's discussion, we've talked about a lot of things relating to communication, hopefully gives you something to think about and take back to your team. Again, you have homework, so let's get on that homework. But if there's a topic, something completely different that you'd love us to cover, have a discussion about, we would love to hear what that is from you. So send us a message and connect with us for sure. But until next time, we will keep the conversation going, and we'll see you same time next week. Have a great week.
Bye.